conference presentations. So as Rachel suggested, there's basically two things that I'm going to be trying to achieve here. I want to give folks a sense of what the economy is looking like in Rhode Island today, though intentionally from the perspective of workers. You know, we're not so concerned about what's going on in the stock markets or how GDP is doing. We want to know how things are for working folks who are getting up every day and going to work. And then I want to give you a sense of some of the things that we've been doing right here in Rhode Island to lift workers up, things that we can certainly improve upon, but we've got some pretty good foundational pieces there that really do make a difference in people's lives. So just jumping right into it here, this slide shows the jobs in Rhode Island over basically since the beginning of the recession. Actually, the chart starts a year before that, and it's actually interesting to see, if you look at that black line, which is the line that sort of goes under the blue, that's jobs. And what you see very clearly there is that even before the official beginning of the national recession in December of 2007, employment in Rhode Island was in free fall. You know, that looks more like a water slide than something that you would want, you know, in terms of an employment track. And so that's sort of the bad news part of this slide. The good news, of course, is that once we hit bottom, looks like it was around between December 2008, December 2009, you'll see that we have, from that point forward, had very steady, not, you know, exceptional, but very steady employment growth. And what the good news there is that we've actually dug ourselves completely out of the hole, at least if you're measuring that hole based on the beginning of the national recession. If you started a little earlier, I think we've still got a little ways to go. The important thing to recall, of course, is that we also need to create enough jobs to keep up with population growth. Otherwise, we're not really in the same place in terms of how the economy is experienced by workers. So, good news that we're out of that hole almost, and certainly the track that we're on, it's fairly clear that we are going to get completely out of that hole. The question, I guess, is whether or not we can get there before some potential inevitable economic downturn down the road. Let's hope that that's the case. Sort of the flip side of the coin, so we've looked at the job creation. This slide is showing you unemployment in Rhode Island and also in our neighboring states. And what you can see very clearly here, Rhode Island is the dark blue line up top, is that Rhode Island experienced the recession in a much deeper way than in our neighboring states. And in a much deeper way than the national trend, which is that lighter blue line that sort of starts off right underneath Rhode Island. That's sort of the bad news. The good news is that we've actually made really impressive progress, and I give full credit to our elected leaders for their role in helping to really inspire our economic growth in Rhode Island. One of the things you see there, if you sort of compare the numbers on the left-hand side and the numbers on the right-hand side, we have an unemployment rate today in Rhode Island at 4.3%. It's almost 2 full percentage points lower than at the beginning of the recession in 2007. That's actually pretty impressive. And it's a little harder to see, but we've actually now surpassed the national rate, which I think currently is sitting at 4.5%. Although by tomorrow we may have a different number to work with. It's also important to recognize that what's happening sort of in quote-unquote the economy, it varies by sector. And those variances are important for working families for a number of reasons. So one thing you see here, Rhode Island in the yellow this time, we've seen impressive employment growth in professional and business services, in leisure and hospitality, decent growth in education and health. At the bottom of the page, unfortunately, we see significant loss, ongoing loss of manufacturing jobs. And as everyone in this room knows, that manufacturing job loss, you know, far predated the period of time that we're looking at here, which is basically from the beginning of the recession. So the implication of that for working families is that we know that historically, manufacturing jobs are the ones that have paid very well. They've paid family supporting wages. And unfortunately, some of those jobs that we're seeing growth in, things like leisure and hospitality, they pay much less well. And you see some of that here. This is actually a slide from a Department of Labor and Training presentation earlier this week. And what you see here is that where we've seen a very significant share of Rhode Island's job growth since, essentially since the end of the recession, 44.6%, nearly half of those jobs have been in a category below $35,000 a year, and the average annual wage in that category is $27,000. So, you know, yes, they're jobs, but those are not great jobs. Those are not jobs that are going to help spur families towards prosperity. And what we see historically is that both our median and low wages have essentially been stagnant. This chart goes back to 2002. You could track it back further, and in fact, if you did track it back further, you would see that we've actually lost some ground in some of these areas. The good news in this slide, I guess, is that you'll notice there is an uptick in both median wages and 10th percentile wages over the last couple of years. That certainly is welcome news, and hopefully it's a trend that we'll see continuing. But again, we see disparity. So if you look at that $17.95 median wage for the whole state, you'll notice that when you look by gender, women are being paid less. When you look by race and ethnicity, you see that African American and Latinos in Rhode Island are being paid significantly less. And so we need to make sure that we have policies in place that help to address those situations as well. And it's also worth highlighting the fact that we have significant economic inequality in Rhode Island. So, as this slide shows, the top 5% of households in Rhode Island receive 18% of the income. If you look at just the top 1%, you see that the income change for that top 1% since 1979, their incomes have gone up 112%, whereas for the rest of us, that quote-unquote 99%, the income change is just 30%. And if you look at the average wages, comparing that top 5%, you'll see that it dwarfs the wages of those in the poorest 20% as well as in the middle. And certainly anything that we can do to lift up those folks who are working hard, just as hard as the top 5%, sometimes harder, we need to make sure that we have policies in place that ensure that the wages that people are working for are ones that they can really push them onto a path of family prosperity. So that's sort of the context for where we are today. What have we done in terms of policy that's very helpful? There's 3 or 4 things that I want to outline here. First of all, the minimum wage is certainly the strongest tool that we have for directly affecting wages. We've made some progress. We still have a long way to go. The governor mentioned that she's supporting a proposal to increase the minimum wage to $10.50 an hour. That would affect 93,000 Rhode Island workers, increasing their wages by $65.2 million. That's obviously pretty significant. If we were to stretch even further, let's say to $15 an hour, we'd be affecting 1 in 3 Rhode Island workers, increasing their wages by about $3,000 on average, and increasing the total wages paid in Rhode Island by about $491 million. Obviously, that's a huge impact. And so, you know, thinking about 1050 is great. If we could be thinking instead, or as well, about a path that gets us towards $15, whether that's in 2, 3, 4 steps, as we have bills to do in the House, actually, that's definitely something we should do, and Senate, of course. And of course, when I'm rushed for time, I almost break the rule at the bottom, which is to not talk about the tip workers. We need to make sure that every time we talk about minimum wage, we're also talking about tip workers, because they're working hard, and we need to make sure that the wages that they take home are also adequate for themselves, and that they have the stability and predictability of a wage that they can count on. So when you put it all together, we actually, if you look at this chart, you might say to yourself, you know, we're actually making progress on the minimum wage. You know, we've gone from $6.15 back in 2000, we're up almost to $10 now. And while that's true, and certainly you can see the uptick over the last few years, which you know, the governor noted is something that's very significant here in Rhode Island, when you throw in the effects of inflation, you see a little bit more nuanced story. So here, when we add in the green line, you're seeing the impact of inflation. And essentially what you do there is you're adjusting backwards over time. And as you can see, between 2000 and 2016, we've seen a very alarming rise in the minimum wage of 97 cents. And so when I'm hearing you know, other folks in opposition to the minimum wage increases talk about the 40% increase in the last 4 years, or whatever numbers they use, you know, they need a reality check, and they need to realize that we're talking about the very lowest wage folks in Rhode Island. Every year that we don't increase the minimum wage is a year when we are effectively giving them a wage cut, and that's unconscionable. The good news is that because we've increased our minimum wage, we've actually made some progress catching up to our neighboring states. This is looking at 10th percentile wages in Rhode Island in the dark blue versus Massachusetts and Connecticut. You can see pretty clearly the gap earlier on was very significant, and now we're pretty much at the same place. Good news. This chart comes from our Rhode Island Standard of Need. And the quick takeaway here, this is looking at basically the cost that would take to make ends meet for a single adult in Rhode Island, $25,751. If you compare that with the current minimum wage, you see that we're a long way from that. The proposal to go to $10.50 starts to close that gap. If we were to go to $12.38, we would close that gap. And that's just for a single adult. So if you're talking about a family that's trying to support kids, obviously those lines go a whole lot further, but the minimum wage line, doesn't adjust to keep up with that. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So that's the minimum wage. Another very important policy is the earned income tax credit. And I certainly applaud the leaders in this room who have helped to keep that moving forward as well. It's a common sense tax break that helps 82,000 low and middle income working Rhode Island families, adding $28.5 million to their pockets every year. Increasing that, we increased that to 12.5% in 2016 and to 15% in 2017. We need to keep pushing on that because even with that, those increases, we're still falling behind our neighboring states, Connecticut and Massachusetts. In Connecticut, they have a 27.5% EITC. These are percentages of the federal EITC, and 23% in Massachusetts. It's important to note that because of the way that the earned income tax credit works, it's putting money in the pockets of low-income folks. Those folks go out into the economy, they spend that money, they spend it immediately, they spend it locally. That helps to keep the Rhode Island economy going. When you add the impact of the multiplier effect, the current 15% EITC adds about $35 million to the local economies here in Rhode Island. And one of the things that we see is that as we have increased that EITC, the total taxes paid by the bottom 20% folks has been coming down. So we know that we have a quote-unquote upside-down tax structure whereby the folks at the lowest end are paying the highest share in their family incomes in taxes. The good news is when we do things like increase the state EITC, we start to make progress on that. And so you can see that by moving to a 15% EITC, we've bounced that down, increasing further to 20, as we have proposals out there today would move that down further. Unfortunately, even with that change, you would see that we would still fall short of catching up with our neighbors in Connecticut and Massachusetts, which tax their lower income folks closer to 10%. A couple of other policies that we're very proud of here in Rhode Island: temporary disability insurance and temporary caregiver insurance. TDI was created in 1942. It provides partial wage replacement for workers who are unable to work due to non-work related injuries or illnesses. Provides up to 30 weeks of benefits, putting $817 a week in benefits at the maximum in their pockets. That also helps not just those families, but also the economy. And with temporary caregiver insurance, we were the third state in the country to implement this. We implemented it in 2014. And with due credit to our leader, Senator Golden, who has played a key role in moving this forward here on Rhode Island, but is also part of helping to keep that rolling at the national level as well. We're also one of the states that's looking very hard at adopting earned sick leave. Currently, we don't require employers to provide paid sick time to employees. There's about 170,000 Rhode Islanders who currently do not have even one paid sick day. With earned sick leave, workers don't have to choose between their health and their paychecks. They don't have to go and work the salad bar while they are fighting a cold, coughing and sneezing all over our food. That's very good news. So definitely an option that from very many perspectives is one that we should be pursuing. We've seen 40 jurisdictions, including 7 states, adopt earned sick leave measures in recent years. And what it shows is that there's not an adverse impact on the economy. In fact, in San Francisco, where they first implemented it, the economy has been, thriving. This is a lovely slide that has way too many words that I'm not going to but people should know that we have materials like this that can help you to understand and to explain to others the difference between PCI and when you use it and earned sick days. One of the arguments that we hear from folks about why we might not want to necessarily adopt earned sick time is that our economy isn't doing as well as other states, and you know, Rhode Island's a different case. Well, my news for those folks is to say, listen, when all of these other states adopted earned sick leave, their unemployment rates were significantly higher than ours is today. In fact, you can see when neighboring Connecticut adopted earned sick time, they had an unemployment rate of almost 9%, and we're at about half of that today. And I need to update this to reflect the 4.3% which we have currently. So one more reason that we think that moving forward with that is the right thing to do.